so much for having me. There is a link here that will have everything that is in this presentation available to you. So the presentation, there are several images and files and examples that will be throughout the presentation that are in the folder so you can access them anytime you need to. And my contact information is in here as well. So before I really launch into this, I want to say this is long. There's a lot of stuff in here, and there are times I'm not going to be able to go as deep into some of these topics as I wish to, but you can go into them. All the images are linked to further resources, and I've included all that stuff in the folders. So first, real quickly, a little bit about me. I'm an editor at Book Riot. I've been working at Book Riot for about 9 years now, and have been covering censorship there from the beginning, but really have seen an uptick in the last year in the sorts of censorship stories that we cover and that need to be highlighted. I'm a former public librarian in Illinois as well as in Wisconsin. I'm an author and editor of books for young adults, and you can contact me. There's my email address and then my Twitter contact. Again, you'll have this after the presentation, so you don't have to write any of it down. And then just a quick, here's what to expect in this presentation. I will go over how we kind of got to this point in censorship, why now, what led to this, and kind of a preview of what we might see in the coming school year. The second part of the presentation will cover how to write a strong challenge policy and reconsideration policy with some examples of ways to handle challenges that may come up. And then ways to find and connect with allies, as well as a few do's and don'ts. So the first thing, and probably one of the most important things to say throughout this entire presentation, is that libraries are not neutral. They've never been neutral. What libraries are is nonpartisan, and really remembering that is going to be helpful as we go through this presentation and as we deal with book censorship now through whenever this hopefully starts to die out, which unfortunately I don't think will be anytime soon. So a little bit about how we got here. A lot of what we're seeing now started in late 2020, particularly as schools did not start to open and come back into the physical space during that school year. A lot of parents decided that schools were not open, even though they were just virtual, and really started to demand schools open. That then led to a whole rise of anti-mask parent-led charges. They wanted schools to get rid of masks. Masks were not doing anything. And from there, we got to anti-critical race theory movements, and now probably what's best seen and considered as parental rights movements. After that 2020 election, right-wing groups really found ways to give their voice and their money to these censorship efforts. On the right is an example of somebody who is very well connected, very well funded, and who has had a significant hand in creating some of the rhetoric and some of the propaganda around critical race theory in this example. But I believe the next slide might show that he's currently working on a similar campaign for gender and sexuality in schools. So we're going to see a lot more attacks on gender and sexuality in the coming school year. As you can see, this tweet came in March 2021, and that date will sound familiar to you as you start to see when the rise of book challenges that were labeled as challenges to critical race theory started to really emerge. I'm not going to read this to you, but you can read it after, and it's just a look at what the mentality is in these groups, why it is they're really fighting against critical race theory, why they're fighting against gender and sexuality, why they're fighting against LGBTQ plus books throughout schools and libraries. So like I said, here's the latest plan. This individual said that he is creating the hysteria around gender ideology in schools. And the very first thing that he did, this was last week, I believe, was try to stir the pot about sexual predators within the schools. So obviously Fox News is not a source that any of us would consider to be legitimate if we're here learning about this, but the audience for this is huge, and the folks who are working to ban books are sharing these sorts of stories and furthering that propaganda. So just a broad look at some of the national grassroots groups that are behind a lot of this censorship. And the one that you may be most familiar with is Moms for Liberty. They got their start in January 2021. They claim that they have over 70,000 members, which, given that we don't know very much about them, we can't verify that that's true. But we do know that they do have a big following. They, as of the time I put this together a couple months ago, were in 33 states and had over 165 chapters. Moms for Liberty operates on the county level. So each county has its own chapter of a Moms for Liberty. And that particular national group has connections with the Heritage Foundation, with Ron DeSantis, and other right-wing politicians and groups. There's a lot of money behind them. Some of the things that they've done include creating a rating system that they have deemed as similar to the movie rating system. And I believe it's a 1 through a 5 system. It's under their website, booklooks.org and booklook.info. It's the same stuff, just 2 different websites. And they review these books. They get screenshots or they scan pages. And then they put together this whole packet about a book. And books that I believe hit a 4 or 5 rating trigger a challenge to that book. They like to do these in waves, and you'll see it coming out of Florida because Florida is where they're based. So you might see out of, I'm trying to think of what the Indian River, I think, is one of the big counties that they start in. You'll see a challenge of like 9 books at once. And it's because they've waited to collect all this stuff. They put those challenges through, and then you see those same books get challenged throughout the country. And you see the same images, the same language, the same pages, the same examples, because they've created the database. They are working and have been working for a while to infiltrate school boards. School boards became such an issue for them because 2 of their 3 founders were failed school board candidates. So this was the group they created when they lost their school board elections. They also have created the Moms for Libraries initiative, which attempts to get very conservative books into school libraries and into public libraries. I don't think they've been very successful with this yet, but the packaging, the language, the way that they frame this makes it sound like it's a good thing, that they aren't banning books, they're trying to get books into libraries. And in New York, there are at least 9 chapters, including Suffolk, Westchester, Dutchess, Wayne, Erie, and Nassau County, which apparently is one of the country's largest Moms for Liberty chapters. In addition to Moms for Liberty, there's No Left Turn in Education, which launched about a year before them in May 2020. They do have state chapters as opposed to county by county chapters. They started in Pennsylvania in the Philadelphia suburbs. And they launched over a book about racism. One parent was mad about that and created this whole organization. They maintain a list of books that they dislike, and they also maintain schools that go against their own beliefs. And then finally, another really big group is Parents Defending Education that started in 2021. They are particularly interesting because they keep a map of what they call indoctrination, schools that go against whatever their very conservative values are. And then they offer all these step-by-step guides for how people can get involved. So they have the ways people can show up to a school board meeting, the things that they should talk about at a school board meeting, how to file a FOIA request, like what to ask for, what you can get. They have this incredible resource, which is only helping get more people engaged in doing these sorts of things. In New York, you do have some groups that are more local. There's the Long Island Loud Majority. They, I believe, don't quote me on this, I believe they were behind the Smithtown Pride Display challenges. And then there are the Concerned Baldwinsville Parents React, which is responsible education and common sense teaching. They were very active in Baldwinsville. And then there's another group in Jersey called Team Protect Your Children, who I guess has had some impact in New York City and the surrounding suburbs. I don't know as much about these individual groups, but I've linked to a couple of them. You can dig in and investigate. So how these groups are working is that they are sharing what they consider to be information through social media. And a lot of them will maintain a Facebook group for individual chapters or local groups, and they share this information with one another. As you might guess, much of the information that they're sharing comes from places like the Daily Signal, which is from the Heritage Foundation, or the Daily Wire, which is Ben Shapiro, Fox News. I showed an example a few slides back about that. Blaze Media is another one. That's Glenn Beck's news network. And then there's a whole host of fake news sites that they utilize, which look like they're really local news, but are not. There have been some right-wing investors who developed this incredibly big network of local-looking news sites that are not local news at all. They're just propaganda machines. And even savvy people, folks who really think that they are good with information literacy, can get sucked into it and believe that it's real because it looks pretty similar to something like what you might see in a local news site. And then they also create these videos, these exposés, these documentaries that they claim to be exposing all these big problems, but really they're just fueling misinformation and therefore fueling engagement as people get enraged and engage with these pieces of media. So one of the big things that these groups talk about is that there are 3 ideologies being presented in public schools, thanks to the CDC, that are all underpinned with Marxism. And I know saying that sounds ridiculous, but I'm going to show some images that kind of lay it out and make it make a little bit more sense. The 3 big things that they are talking about and that they are against are critical race theory, so CRT, SEL, which is social emotional learning, and then comprehensive sexuality education. And they say sexuality education. These are all things within CDC's real whole school, whole community, whole child model, which is their idea of like what a solid, healthy school should look like. But for these groups, this is what they believe to be indoctrination. They like to call them not public schools, but government schools. And the ultimate goal, the end game for these book challenges, which started as anti-CRT measures, which started as anti-mask mandates, which started as open up the schools again, is to create disarray in public education and thereby create the opportunity to defund public education and funnel that money into private education. We saw this year the Supreme Court decision that in states where there are voucher programs that allow for using those vouchers for private education, for religious education, there was a big win on that. So these groups were thrilled. They want to see that kind of thing go nationwide so that they can continue to enroll their children in these giant, well-funded homeschool cooperatives and also these very right-wing conservative Christian private schools. Look at some of the language you might hear in these groups, and the language you'll hear around why books are being challenged include indoctrination, include grooming. We've seen that one quite a bit. Obscenity, which they conveniently cherry pick how they talk about obscenity. Every single obscenity law says that obscene means that the work, when taken as a whole, is not okay. They leave out, conveniently, that taken as a whole so that they can show a picture from Genderqueer, for example. They can show 4 pages of Genderqueer in a 200-plus page memoir and say, this shows why this book is obscene, even though it is not in any way, under any definition, obscene. Other words, they use pornography. We're going to hear that a lot more. Particularly educators and those in public schools are peddling pornography. They talk about parental rights, and they're very obsessed with saying they do not co-parent with the government. And then again, some of the abbreviations, CSE is comprehensive sex education, CRT is critical race theory, and SEL is social emotional learning. So some graphics and some visuals that might help make some of this sound a little bit less out there. When you've been like in this world for so long and been studying this, like you see the train of logic, but if you're hearing it for the first time or haven't spent that much time with it, it can be a lot. But these 2 graphics, both of which are included in the files you'll get, kind of show like what they're thinking and the kinds of stuff that's getting shared. Particularly of interest on the right is this guide to the definitions of these words. So social justice, critical race theory. And when you go down to the bottom and you see who the sources are, you see the doctors label before their names. So it looks legitimate to a lot of these folks who've never engaged with this before. I'm not going to talk about these in depth, but these can be a great way to kind of see and visualize like where these arguments, where their propaganda, where their ideas are spreading. And then a couple more graphics. These came to me from an activist in Wisconsin who really laid out in a visual way what I've been trying to talk about in words. And you can kind of see here, reopen the schools led to unmasking the kids, led to, it's my body, my choice about the vaccines. And then that led to this parental rights in education, which meant banning CRT, getting rid of naughty books, and as you'll probably be familiar with, trans bathroom issues continue to be something at the forefront of their minds. And again, it's about parents' rights and school privatization. And then here's another great visual for this. As you can see, this one's really up to date too, with that tweet from Rufo who says, gender ideology is the next thing that is coming up. I think it's really important to point out that somebody like Rufo will tweet this stuff and it's like, well, that sounds wild. Like, why would people believe if he's like laying out what's going to happen? How does it happen? Like, why does nobody stop him? It's very clear, like, this is all manufactured. But the thing is, they don't care. It doesn't matter. It works. And then again, I'm not going to read this, but another really great visual of like how these things all come together. Transitioning a little bit now to more specific, like challenge related stuff. PEN America highlighted the top 5 states with the most book bans this year, which include Texas, Pennsylvania, Florida, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Indiana. And you can click through on this to read a little bit more about that. This is why you'll see a lot of stories that come out of these states. Florida is where Moms for Liberty started. Pennsylvania is where No Left Turn started. And then states like Texas, Oklahoma, and Indiana have very active county and state level groups. From PEN, you can see on the left the types of stories that are being banned: protagonists of color, queer characters, anything related to sex or health. Now, this was created in March, at the end of March. I would suspect at this point, now that we're just about in August, that we'll see a flip in the first 2 topics there. I suspect that more books with queer characters or topics are now being challenged than those with protagonists of color. Of course, intersectionally, the bulk of books are going to have both, or have an author of color and a queer character. Anywhere there's intersections, those books are particularly targeted. The right is ALA's list of the top 10 most challenged books this year. Genderqueer is number 1, with Me and Earl and the Dying Girl as the number 10. But again, you'll see protagonists of color, you'll see your queer characters, you'll see books addressing race or racism. The top 10 are pretty much mirroring, what's been banned on a broader scale. So I wanted to pull a few stories from New York. Now, again, this is just a few. The first one, the one that I have not stopped thinking about, is that Lauren Moore, the state librarian, disappeared from her job after talking about the power of genderqueer. She was part of a program through the state library, like highlighting challenged books, and she was pictured with genderqueer and talked about why it was such an important book. And then she disappeared from her job for several days. I don't know what happened. I know that people who worked with her were concerned about her disappearance. She was reinstated, but nothing else has been said afterward. There's been some discussion that because the Libs of TikTok account, which is a hate Twitter account, got a hold of this, that her job was in jeopardy. Following that, there was the Smithtown Pride display, which was removed and then reinstated, and that was just a few weeks ago. Several books have been under challenge in Baldwinsville. In Plain Edge, parents complained about but did not successfully remove Front Desk by Kelly Yang. And in Delmer, there's been controversy over books that the board donated to the library that were queer-friendly, and parents defending education didn't like this. Wappingers Central District banned genderqueer. That's in the Hudson Valley. I think that one took a lot of people by surprise. Connecticut High School is currently reviewing genderqueer. And in this particular story, the parent who filed the complaint is affiliated with Moms for Liberty, has gone to anti-mask rallies, and a thing that I've seen several times, doesn't even have kids in the school district. She pulled them out. If you work backwards from this, you kind of see the logic. She pulled her kids from the school because she didn't feel like her kids were getting a good education, and it didn't follow in her view of what a proper education should be. And That ties into, don't mask the kids at school, and this sort of vitriol, this sort of movement to pull the books, is in alignment with how we got to this point. The Auburn School District had a complaint about All Boys Aren't Boo, but they did keep the book. 9 books were challenged in Yorktown. Field Library saw 30 books, queer books, disappear during Pride Month, which was likely a result of Hide the Pride, a organized campaign by a very conservative Catholic group to check out all of the queer books on Pride displays and not return them. One of the first stories from last year was the Hate U Give being challenged in Putnam County. So now you've got all this information, and I recognize that it is a lot of information to take in. But there are things you can do to be proactive here. Whether you anticipate having any challenges or you simply want to be prepared for conversations you may need to be having, be them in the library or with the community. So first and foremost, update your challenge policy. ALA's sample policy is a start, but it's pretty flimsy and does not give a real process or what should be required to launch a formal review of a book. Include this in your collection development policy and also as a separate document and resource. So I'm going to give you some ideas for what to have in this challenge policy. But first, the purpose of it is to protect you as a professional and protect the rights of your patrons to access any information that they desire. Of course, they uphold the First Amendment rights of everybody, and they give a formal avenue to address concerns in a uniform manner. So if you take informal complaints, there is really an opportunity for these challenges not to be handled uniformly. And I often think of when you're in, let's say, a public library, you have so many people doing so many different jobs in the library. You have your high schoolers who are shelving books after school. You have your folks who are working circulation and dealing with checkouts, check-ins, card-related issues. You have your reference librarians. So what happens if somebody takes a book that they're unhappy about being in the library and complains to the teenager who's just shelving books? They might not be aware of what the process is or what the procedure is, but they might do something unintentionally, or they might make a promise to that patron that they will make sure that the book is dealt with, or that they'll bring it up. And it's not intentional. It's not because they're trying to do something bad. It's because they simply don't know. So creating a challenge policy and making sure that everybody is aware of it and is aware that there is a formal process will help to ensure that everybody in the library is safe and everybody is responding in the same way. So this is a really, really great statistic, again, from the report from PEN America earlier this year that's linked. The bulk of books that have been banned in school libraries have been banned because they are not following their own policies. So having a strong policy is important, but so is following those policies. Of the 76 districts at the time who had dealt with challenges, only 11 had formal reconsideration policies and followed them consistently, which is tiny. So in developing a challenge policy, you want to articulate the purpose of a library collection and then tie it into your First Amendment rights, liberty, justice, and freedom. And using any or all of those words is really, really important because those are the very words that these very conservative groups are using about why they're challenging books, why these books shouldn't be in libraries or in the curriculum. Outline the exact steps of the formal process. Give a timeline. Say who's going to be on the committee. Give contact points. If the person who is filing the complaint wants to follow up, they reach out to X person and they can do so after so many days. Lay out what information is used to make a decision. And then more than anything, make this form really accessible and easy to locate. These groups are obsessed with transparency. So the more transparent you can be, the more you're already meeting what their demands are. You may never ever need to use this, and hopefully you never have to use it. But by having it on your website, by having it in a place that is easy to find and access, you're already taking one of the chief complaints out of their mouths of, well, you make it impossible to find anything, or how are we supposed to know? The answer is it's been right on the website. Be explicit in what a challenge requires. I'm going to show an example form. I think it's in the next slide, but You want to make sure that when they're filing the challenges, that the materials were read in full, they were understand, and that the points of contention are not simply copy and pasted from somewhere else. So I mentioned Moms for Liberty keeps a couple of databases. So does No Left Turn and several other groups on Facebook. Mary in the Library is a big one. They're out of Utah. And they have chapters in different states. And basically what these people are doing is creating the things that somebody would challenge. So they put the page numbers, they put the examples in an easy place for people to access. Once you see it's just been copy and pasted, that should invalidate the complaint. It needs to be done by the person filling out the paperwork. It also might be smart to limit how many challenges a person can have active at once, and then creating a period of time from which after a decision cannot be changed. So, for example, somebody can challenge 5 books at once. And then if a decision is made that all 5 books can stay in the library, they can't be challenged again for 5 years, 6 years, whatever you decide works in your library and your community. Again, this is all in the interest of transparency and creating a way to allow patrons to file complaints. That's their right, but also protect you as a library worker and you as somebody thinking about the interests of the whole community. Lastly, this is my suggestion, is to include the cost of a book challenge in your form. You can use estimates and consider costs for acquiring the materials for each committee member, the time spent reading material, and then the cost for accessing reviews of the material and attending meetings to talk about the material. These groups are obsessed with talking about tax money and how their tax money is being used. If you can be transparent right back, you are just using their language and thinking about things the same way that they think about things. What should a challenge policy include? I adapted much of this from Martha Hickson's template. And Martha Hickson is a school librarian in New Jersey who dealt with a number of challenges in the past year. I believe she was quoted in the recent New York Times article as well. And she put together this brilliant presentation that's linked here that talks about everything that a challenge policy should include. So this is pulled from that. Explain the purpose of the material. Have your person who's complaining know what the material is about. Have them lay out positive qualities, what their concerns are, including page numbers and quotes, how the material has been assessed in professional review sources, and have them include citations. What you're going to start seeing is exactly what I've laid out. Their citations are coming from non-reputable sources. Their reviews are coming from, any old Moms for Liberty member who sat down, read the book, was offended, and put this post in Book Looks or Books Looks, whatever one that they choose to put it in. That stuff's going to help you. Not only is it going to help you in how a decision's made about the book, but it's going to give you a real idea of what's happening, what the discourse is, and where they're getting all this information, why they're coming back over and over again with more challenges that all sound really, really similar. The last one's one that I added and I think is really important. In your challenge policy, if you include a line about why you believe the book should be restricted to community members, including children, I would hope, I know it's probably not the case, but I would hope that would be a pause, remember, you get the right to tell your children what they can and cannot access, but you don't get to make that choice for everybody else. I don't have it in here. I may have linked it, but for sure it's in the files. There's a sample challenge policy that you could use and adapt as you want to. It's a Google Doc. I also wanted to quickly hit on silent, quiet self-censorship, however you prefer to call it, but this is when you choose to remove or not purchase material simply because it might lead to complaints within a community. It happens at all levels, and it's a weak policy. It's a lack of policy that really enables this kind of censorship. You want to be really proactive. So if you're considering purchasing an item that might cause some discomfort in the community, that might cause a challenge, you want to document why you purchased it, document comp materials, circulation numbers, have all that stuff together and handy so that if it does come up, you can say, well, I use my professional judgment and, similar books have checked out really frequently. So this was a perfect item to include in the collection. And I'm going to reiterate this. It's still censorship and a violation of the First Amendment rights to your community if you engage in silent or quiet censorship. The happens at all levels link will take you to a longer story about this, both from those who have feared what happens if they purchase something and those who have decided to just shy away from doing a lesson or a book club that would have been really, really beneficial for their students out of fear of what might happen if somebody found out. And then some tips for if you're dealing with a challenge, like what should you be doing in the meantime? Familiarize yourself with the material. And if you can, I recommend doing it on work time. Again, this is part of your job, and it's not something you should be taking home with you. And because we want to think about this in the same manner that people who are challenging are thinking about this, this is taxpayer money, use it. And while you're doing that, note all the things that you can't do. So if you have to read this material during what would be a period of time that you're preparing for a lesson or preparing a book club or preparing any number of things, like write that down, document it. The challenge needed to be handled, so you didn't get to actually do your job that day. Draft a response to the complaint and address each point with evidence-based research reviews and examples from the book in question. This shows that you're really engaging with the complaint, that you're really thinking about it and you're taking it seriously, which for a lot of these folks, it's not going to be good enough, but you can know that you took it seriously, that you did your job. Don't reinvent the wheel, because a lot of these books, particularly the very challenged ones, already have these kinds of resources put together. I've linked to one for a challenge to Jack of Hearts and Other Parts that took place outside Seattle in the suburbs. The school librarian there at a middle school had purchased that book and a couple others to have some more queer books in his library. And in that situation, the administrator pulled the books. There was a situation of quiet censorship there, and he blew the whistle. After that, there were several more challenges of this Jack of Hearts in particular. And so he put together this incredible document that is 20-some pages addressing every challenge point, including reviews, including why this book, needs to be in this collection, and including research on why having this sort of material in a school library is beneficial for all students. And ultimately, the book was retained. That decision came down last month, I believe. It was a very long process, but that can be an awesome template for what you might do or what you might look for. And I know Gavin is cool with that particular one being shared because he doesn't want other people to deal with this as well. Of course, be conscious of what you cite. Right now, there are a lot of these groups who really disregard anything related to ALA, including Booklist. So you might have to look for reviews in a few different places. If Booklist, for example, is your go-to, include others in addition to that. You'll want to choose an approach whether you are going to monitor all of the discussion of this challenge on social media because you can, or choose not to monitor at all. Neither one's right or wrong. What works best for you is the right approach to take. Also, make a decision if you're going to approach the media or not. ALA's stance is not to, but approaching the media can bring some really great support and put pressure on current or future people who want to censor or challenge books in your community and beyond your community. And then consider updating your library website with a challenge update. So again, this goes back to transparency. Eanes School District in Texas had and still has a very vocal parent rights group who wants to challenge all these books. And so they've been filing challenge after challenge after challenge. And finally, the board put together a list on their website of each book that's been challenged, when it was challenged, who challenged it, and where it is in the review process. This absolutely ticked off everybody who had demanded for this very transparency. But it helps you find your allies, one, and two, it gives them exactly what they're asking for. You want to know where this book that you challenged is, like what's the status? It's right there. And you can look for your name and find it. This is an example of like a good response to how much it costs for a review of a challenge book. This is Francis Howell School outside St. Louis, I believe. This one just talked about the cost of the book for each committee member. And I thought that this was great. It's right in the board doc information, so anybody can access it. I would have added about $600 to that to cover the cost of time. And then here's another example, again, Francis Howell, of how they responded to a decision, the rationale behind why they decided to keep a book. And this is also in the files that you'll be able to access afterward. But you want to provide a rationale for your decision. And if you want to be really, really transparent, explain who made what vote. You'll want to include the original challenge information. And then if you can, reiterate the costs of the challenge. And then our last section, allies, tools, and resources. All the old things that used to work don't quite work now. Things are different. Some of the old things still work, but there are so many more resources out there. It's worth kind of knowing what else you can use too. For me, I think the biggest thing folks are missing is how important local school boards and library boards are. You want to know who's on those boards, and you want to know it both for where you work and where you live, if it's two separate things. You want to work with these governing bodies on policies that ensure everybody has the right to speak at these things, but also that they're following procedure. So this example here that you can click on later is out of a community in North Carolina, Iredell, I believe is where it is, where they had Moms for Liberty folks using up public comment time to read passages from these books they were mad about. None of these people actually filed a formal review or a formal complaint. So the board president said, "Did you file a formal complaint?" And the person would say, "No, but I'm going to read this because how dare you have this pornography in the library?" And again, the board president would say, "Did you file a complaint? We've got the paperwork. Like, there's a way to do this." And while they were allowed their speaking time, that in and of itself really shut down whatever they had to say afterward. Clearly there's an avenue for this, but they're choosing not to go that route so that they can be their little, give their little performance at the board. Of course, vote in elections, run if you can. And if you're in a library where this is possible, consider hosting candidate forums and information sessions on the importance of local elections and local democracy. Moms for Liberty has been doing it in different states across the country, and the library as a government body should be doing the same thing. Know who your representatives are, get on their mailing lists, and put their information in your hands. You want to know who to call, who to write to, and keep tabs on what your lawmakers are working on. I periodically search relevant keywords in the House and Senate just to see what legislators are working on. So parent rights would be a good one, obscenity, like any of those keywords, you can search and just see what's going on. Of course, and I'm going to say this is maybe the second most important thing in this presentation, is to keep yourself protected. Any information that you communicate, if you work in a public institution, so a public library, a public school, can be FOIA'd. Even if you delete it, it's not gone. And these groups are FOIA-ing everything. So I think the best mentality to take with this is, if you don't want it on a billboard, if you don't want whatever you say, good or bad, plastered on a billboard, don't share it in writing. And I emphasize good and bad because you could be talking about how excited you are. You got this grant to purchase a whole collection of queer books, and you can't wait to get these queer books into teen hands. That gets FOIA'd, all the context is stripped, and suddenly you are labeled a groomer because you cannot wait to get queer books in teen hands. That's a good thing, but for those folks, that's their proof. Stay calm and know that nothing ever requires an immediate response. So don't let this false sense of urgency, if you're dealing with a challenge, guide your decision making. Take your time, do things properly, go through the proper channels. And then, of course, safeguard all of your personal information with a privacy check. This link will take you to a guide to kind of look online for what's out there and then how to get rid of that information. It's a couple years older than I usually link to, but it's still one of the best ones out there. Know your patrons, solicit their feedback, encourage them to write to library boards, to school boards, praising what's happening in your library. A story came out this week that I think it was St. Tammany Parish in Louisiana. They had a pride display last month, and there were some people who were upset about the pride display, but of the 45 letters they got about the pride display, only 5 were complaints. Everybody else wrote about how vital it was that this was there and how grateful they were it was there. That, I think, is huge. I think that makes a huge difference. So encourage your patrons to do not just the things that they're, upset about, but encourage them to write about the great things that they're seeing. It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be brilliant. As simple as, I really love that you had a pride display, works wonders. In addition to that, I would consider having a worried about censorship resource right on your webpage and on social media that talks about what's going on around the country, what's going on more locally, maybe highlighting if you've dealt with challenges and what the outcomes of those have been. All that stuff is FOIA-able, so you're not sharing anything that they wouldn't be able to get with a little time. Tap your power users to write to the local paper, to city council about specific needs and interests being met. Have them write about how great your collection is, how great your programming is, how glad you are that you had a pride display or a drag story time. Your power users also make for great board representation. Share your resources and your experiences. Every single challenge is going to be different, but if you have a unified response plan, that's going to protect you the most. And document everything, even if it seems like nothing. It probably is nothing, but you never want to get into this false sense of security, just in case it isn't nothing. For example, you're dealing with a challenge and you get some weird phone calls. Document that just to keep yourself protected, and then share that with others. I know that in the Chicago area, there was recently, during Pride Month, one of the libraries had a patron complain about a pride display in the children's area, and they said, no other children's area in the Chicagoland libraries has a pride display in the kids area. And so what did that librarian do? She picked up the phone and called every single one of them, and it was blatantly untrue. But that information then spreads that people are complaining and making these statements that are just not true. Of course, regularly update policies and procedures, and remember that they're living documents so that they can always be updated. Some places to turn to who will keep you updated on censorship news, who can be helpful. If you find yourself in a situation where you need support, every library has been fantastic through all of this. They have helped so many libraries and librarians who are struggling with challenges and giving them the support that they need. PEN America has been great as well. And the information that they're putting out there really helps keep you on top of what's going on, as well as to feel empowered, like what's happening, not just in your community, but across the country. Of course, state and local library organizations are going to be great. Look for local and national media that you can trust. Red, Wine, and Blue is a parents group that started after the 2016 election, I believe. Don't quote me on that, but they're trying to be the opposite of Moms for Liberty. They're trying to empower suburban women in particular to show up to the polls, to vote blue, to get involved in progressive issues. I do a lot of really cool trainings, which might be not necessarily what you need as professionals, but might be really valuable for your community members to know about. Additionally, you've got the First Amendment Project, you've got local ACLU chapters. Each state chapter is a little different. Some are more engaged than others. In North Carolina, when genderqueer was pulled from Wake County Public Libraries, ACLU chapter there was super crucial in getting that turned around. The Freedom to Read Foundation, so ALA, just note that their Office for Intellectual Freedom right now has one staff member. So they are slow because they don't have the staffing capacity. And then also National Coalition Against Censorship. And then just quickly, a few more resources. Taslin Magnuson keeps this incredible book censorship database that you can access via every library. I pulled together my censorship coverage and then Book Riot's literary activism newsletter, as well as how to fight book bans and censorship toolkit, which will be helpful for you as professionals, but probably even more helpful for patrons who are wondering what they can do. A guide to using FOIA. And then some folks who are doing really cool work. Franklin Strong is an educator in Texas who's been great about highlighting what's going on there and giving it a broader perspective. In particular, he talked about after the spring elections, what he noticed about different educational bills and whether they did or didn't pass, or the sorts of people who got on school boards and the language that was around them. I wish I can think of the example off the top of my head, but there was something about, do you believe in public education versus is it important for children to learn in schools? And it's like, it was a very slight difference in the language, made a big difference in how people responded. Adventures in Censorship, Richard Price has been writing these deep dives into different censorship stories throughout the country and throughout history. The Florida Freedom to Read Project is a group of women who are fighting against what Moms for Liberty is doing down in Florida. And They're one of the most active and savvy groups that I've seen come out of this. And just watching what they're doing is really, really motivating, and I think could be helpful for other citizens who want to do something similar. We've got a project that I have been working on with one of my coworkers called the School Board Project. There's an update coming to that tomorrow where we are going through every single state, pulling out every single school district, how many seats will be up in the next election, when the next election is, and then a direct link to that school board. So folks can use this information any way that they want to. The Florida Freedom to Read Project folks, for example, are using it to highlight who the Moms for Liberty candidates are in each of those elections so that folks know who not to vote for. And again, sample collection policy, challenge policy responses, all those images that you saw, they're linked in this presentation and they're also in the Google Drive. And then real quick, some resources you don't want to know but should know about. These are the things that the right is using to further their propaganda. I'm not going to go through them, but you can click through them if you'd like. And that is my presentation. Thank you to everybody. And as I always say when I end these, it's a lot of information and a lot of it can be overwhelming, but know if you're here and you're thinking about it and you're showing up, that's huge in and of itself. So keep doing the good work. Thank you.